Okay, so good morning. Today's lesson is CT9. So I'll give you your screens back in a moment and you need to find CT9 in half term 2. But let's go through the theory for it. You've seen quite a lot of this already, but the focus now shifts on to readability. So most programs involve input, process and output. We've done a lot on input and output. Now we want to give you some more tools to focus on the process bit, the calculation bit. And one of the most powerful tools that we've got is selection, as in making a choice. Imagine going into a sweet shop and choosing, do I want the custard, rhubarb and custard? Do I want the tang fastics? You make a selection based on your own preferences. And we are now empowering our code to do the same kind of thing, to make its own choices. So we're going to start with some flowcharts. Is it raining? Middle of the night last night was super, super rainy. I slept right through it. I don't know if you heard it. But in a flowchart, lots of us last time forgot to put the yeses and the nos and forgot to put the arrows. A flowchart is supposed to be unambiguous. No room for confusion. So it's got to be crystal clear. You either go this way or this way. How do you know? Well, it's based on a decision. It's based on this particular decision. Sorry, this is the set of decisions that you're going to need to make. These are all the things you need except for your lines and your arrows. You must have arrows here. So you're probably best off recreating these because this is just one picture, which is really, really irritating. Sorry about that. So insert shapes, and all of the flowchart ones are down at the bottom. Remember, you don't need to put a text box over the top of it. You can just start typing. And other top tip, if you choose to style the black and white one and then right click set default shape, that means whenever you draw your next flowchart shape thing, like one of the decisions, where's it's gone, you don't have to set the format again, it's already the same. So I've thrown lots of things at you. It's CT9 please on the VM. Okay, so let's move on to task 2, activity 2. You tend to find these questions as a question 3 in paper 2. What am I talking about? Well, you've got 2 exams at the end of year 11, and you've got 1 mock exam this year. 1 mock exam, I think, late May, and that'll be a paper 2, an on-screen Python test, where you've got 2 hours to work through some code in Python. I think they're really fun exams because you get instant feedback and you can see if it works. It's not like you do something on paper and you wait for a couple of weeks until your teacher's marked it. You know how you're doing straight away. So all of these CT lessons feed into those paper 2s. This is like a question 3 where you get given some code. All the code you need is there. It's just in the wrong order. And there are some top tips. I think I've gone through this before, but I want to remind you. You just need to rearrange them, but don't copy Control-C and Control-V because then you'll have multiple copies of the lines. Use your keyboard, not your mouse. Home goes to the beginning, end goes to the end. And shift and arrow keys, or shift and end and shift and home selects the whole line. Instead of Control-C, it's Control-X. Think of a pair of scissors with an X with your fingers. It's cut. So Control-X will cut. Now let's think about the logic here. Edexcel, it's the exam board we use, always likes us to declare to the world that we have a global variable. We're saying we are going to store something. And the weight is going to be a floating point number, a real number. So even though Python doesn't need us to set it to 0 at the beginning, our exam board would like us to because it's considered good practice in other programming languages, and that's what they want us to do. Then, let's think input, process, output. What comes first? One of these is an input. So we look at what asks us a question, and we cut that and put that at the top. And in your paper 2s, whenever you have these big fat arrow things, they give you your instructions. So arrange these lines to make the code work. All right, I will do. We're going to have some syntax errors. Remember, in your exam, you're allowed to run your code. You're expected to run your code, and it's helpful. And it tells us we've got a problem on line 16. Well, big rule in Python, any line with a colon on the end expects the next line to be indented. But this is not the next line. Now, we've also got some weird logic here. You can't say else until you've said if. So if is going to come first. If a condition is met, then something. Otherwise, if, and then else. So if this is true, then do something. If the thing on line 16 is not true, but this is true, we'll do something else. Otherwise, in every other scenario, so all you've got to do is just rearrange these to put them in the right place. I'm not going to do everything for you. You can do that yourselves. Let's have a quick look at activity 3. Here we have a flowchart. This is a little bit like a question, could be a question 2 in paper 2. You've been given a flowchart and you've got to translate it into Python code. It's actually a lot easier than it looks. I'll plop that on one side and we'll get create with code on the other. So we start at the top. There is no Python instruction for start, we just ignore it. This is initialization. We set the initial values for all of them. I'm not going to do all of them, but I want to get you started. Cost small. Remember, you can't have variables with spaces in. And oh dear, I'm overwriting stuff. So I'm going to press the insert key on the keyboard so that it inserts instead of overwrites. So let's try again. Cost small equals 10.25. This tells us that there will be a variable and it's going to store a real value or a floating point value, a number that is not an integer. So we do the same for all of these. Then we have input. So we know that input in Python asks a question. We need to know what the question is. Oh, I'm still inserting. That's irritating. There we go. Number of t-shirts. Here we go. T-shirts, teachers, T. There we go. Wake up, Mr. Drink. Much better. If it's a question, it's rude not to listen to the answer. So which of these variables is going to put them in? Probably number, I guess. But input returns a string, and we want an integer. So yeah, we need to wrap this function call with brackets so that we can convert it into an integer. And that's this one here. So you just go through, and if I was in an exam, I would tick off these on the bit of paper as I typed them in code, and you just go through one by one until you get to say this one. This is a decision in a flowchart. How am I going to write this decision in Python? So I know I haven't done all of these, but let's just type it out. If size is equal to S. Well, that doesn't look right. What do we mean by S? That's probably a user input that the user types in for size. Here we go. So I need to change this a little bit. How am I going to do that? So for activity 4, we talk about readability. It's all about trying to make your code as easy to read as possible, because if it's easier to understand, then you're less likely to make mistakes and it's easier for someone else to fix in future. So far we've talked about variables. Variables are things that might change whilst the program runs, like size. The user can set it to any value. It's a variable. It stores a value that might vary. It might change whilst the program runs. So here we have some code that looks rather confusing because it has lots of numbers in. You know, and I know, that 3.14159 is pi. It's one of those magical mathematical constants that never changes. So if a number has a name, it makes sense to give it a name and to call it by that name, because now our code is easier to understand. The only thing we need to be careful of is defining that first. So that's the example here. This is our example. Here, this has a number in here that we don't necessarily understand. But if we look up here, it gives us a little bit of information. So students don't pay VAT on children's clothing. 0% rate. So that 0 has a meaning. So let's just write exactly the same thing. Give it a name. Notice constants have names written in capital letters. It's not shouting. It's just saying it's a constant. And it tells the Python programmer, don't change this unless you really know what you're doing. And we need to define that value, usually right at the very top of the program. So your job is to find a number, give it a name, and then define that, and they're all defined for you up at the top. Okay, top tip for this, if you go view and split, then you can see the table at the same time as the bit that you're writing. It's really helpful. Let's view and split. So when you've saved your CT9, it needs submitting onto half term 2 algorithms and programming 2, please.